You are now listening to the Big Beyond Belief podcast with your host, Leo Costa Jr.
Hey everyone, this is Leo Costa Jr. coming to you from bigbeyondbelief.com. Today I'm going to do a show and I'm going to be the special guest on the show. Now, if that's not narcissistic, I don't know what is, but I guess that just goes to show you that you, once you get hooked onto bodybuilding, you can never get off. You can never get off the pipe, man. You always want to be out there. Anyway, I'm actually inspired on this show by a couple of the interviews that I have done just in the last few weeks. I did a show with Jerry Ward, and I also did a show with Carl Lenore. And both of those guys, throughout the course of the interview, they told me that they had, been a fan, and they'd been on some of the training programs that were written about bodybuilding. And the thing that blew me away, and I just didn't really think about it too much because it's been so long since we've been around the industry, 25 years, that when Carl Lenore and Jerry said that the bodybuilding courses that we wrote, and when I say we, I mean Dr. Russ Horine and I, 25 years ago, after I came back from a trip from Bulgaria, we sat down and wrote a training course. And the first one was Bulgarian Burst. And then we went on to write Serious Growth Training, Big Beyond Belief, Titan Training. And the thing about this is when I interviewed with Jerry and Carl, both those guys said something. They said, Leo, you don't realize what kind of an impact that you have made on the market with your bodybuilding courses. And it was humbling, and it's just like when you've been around so long, you just kind of take it for granted or something, but we are still relevant out there. That is exactly the point that they were making. And of course, I think that the mark of any, someone who is still relevant after all these years, whether it be, our program or a professional athlete, anybody in their different industry, when they stand the test of time, there's something to be said for that. It's because the program, in this case, works. And, after those two interviews, I called my best friend, Dr. Russ Horine, and I told him, I said, man, you don't probably realize that how big of an impact we actually made. We made our mark out there in the industry. And it just, I don't know, it just got me fired up in a way that, I really want to start doing, more of these shows. But today's show, I wanted to focus on the evolution of microperiodization, because that was sort of the crux and a big part of the programs that we wrote. Just like in Jerry's case, and not Carl, but Jerry's case, we got a group of people out there, as I'm realizing, that have used and still in some cases are using our program. But like in Jerry's case, he was even born when we wrote the first two training courses. I mean, that kind of just told me that, maybe we need to come back out again a little bit here and talk about how this all happened. Because we have a whole different group of people that should be and might be interested in a program that produces results every time. So that's the crux of this whole program. I'm going to be kind of, interviewing myself in a way, or just talking about, how this all started. And basically it started in around 1985 when I was one of 26 people that were chosen to go to Bulgaria, Russia, and Czechoslovakia at the time. And I was one of 26 because you had to, send in and get approved and all that. I was one of 26 people from all over the country that were going to this Hush Hush Symposium. And I mean, talk about excitement. It was, you just don't know what you're going to, run into, especially when you're going into the East Bloc at that time. I mean, East Bloc, where I went, wasn't communism, but they were just coming out of that, and it was more socialistic. But the thing is, I really got a shock right off the bat when I climbed on one of the planes. I flew from L.A. or whatever to, I think it was New York, and that's where I boarded the an airline that was from, I think it's from Bulgaria, pretty sure, or Russia. And that's when, I mean, the eyes began to get open in a really kind of weird way. First of all, the thing that I noticed when I got on the plane was that the safety rules that they have and the way they go about, boarding the plane was so much different than in our country. There were no safety rules that were given. It was pretty much when you went on the plane, it was like, hurry up and get in your seat because the pilot's in a hurry. And sure as hell, within 10 or 15 minutes, I mean, the plane was moving, even with passengers roaming around on the plane. And I'm thinking, oh boy, I don't know if this is good or a bad thing. But nevertheless, that's when my experience began. So, and then it goes from there. We land in this foreign country and nobody speaks English at this time where I'm at. I think I flew into Sofia or Varna, one of those two. And then it was the hotel, and I'm just a dumb American at this point, I had never really been to a country like this. And I just assume a lot of things, like, for example, that the hotel is going to have hot water all the time. I also assume that elevators, when they stop at a floor, they're going to stop evenly at the floor instead of the elevator being 6 inches too high or too low. Toilet paper. I mean, we have an abundance in this country, an abundance of everything, but especially toilet paper. Not over there. You had so many, they have them in squares. There's so many squares that you have. And I'll tell you what, you learn time management and how to manage toilet paper as well. And what the hell was up with the bidet? I didn't know what the hell a bidet was. What was I supposed to do? Wash my hands in that, take a pee or what? I didn't know. But, and then at night, when we came back in our room, it was very obvious that somebody had gone through my luggage. They just tore stuff up, not in a bad way, but you can just tell things were disheveled. And it was no secret. I was in a socialistic country, and at that time, they were nosy. They wanted to know what the hell you were doing in their country. And of course, then there's the food. To be honest with you, I don't really remember the food. It seems like I had borscht. I don't know if that's food or not, but I think it is. I don't remember the food being, unexpectedly good, but obviously I lived through it, so it must have been good enough to keep me alive. But I tell you what, they had definitely the worst coffee that I've ever drank. I remember that. It's because it's traumatic. The coffee was literally like mud. But because I'm so, addicted to mud as much as I am to bodybuilding and training, I drank it anyway. But the other thing that I remember was their vodka. Oh my, vodka could be drank at the room level. It was on the table at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was just a part of their course of meals. And again, so those are the things that I remember about initially going into this brand new country, the East Bloc, And so what was their training like? Okay, so we were there basically to learn about how the national Olympic teams trained in these three countries, Bulgaria, Russia, and Czechoslovakia. The first stop that we made was in Bulgaria. And so the thing that was really cool about this that I'll always remember was how forthcoming that the Bulgarians were. Compared to the other two countries, they were the most forthcoming. I mean, they just revealed everything to the point where I told them, I said, look, I'm here to see and your training and to talk to your sports doctors and your Olympic coaches and all that. But I also wanted to let them know that my intention was maybe if, depending on the information, I wanted to go back to the USA and write a book on bodybuilding. And they had no issue with that. They were, unlike the Russians, especially the Russians, the Bulgarians were wide open, and their rationale to me was, we don't care what you do with this information, because we're 8 years ahead of the West, the USA, and what you're going to see here. and we're constantly progressing. By the time that you get this information out, we're going to be on to something different. And I thought, wow, that is pretty cool. So, I mean, can you imagine? I was actually in the weight room of the National Olympic team, the Bulgarian team. Mind you, in 9 years, when they started focusing on Olympic lifting, they became the number one country. They dethroned Russia, which you have to understand, it's so competitive during these days that, having Russia dethroned by a little country, Bulgaria is a very small country, and being dethroned in as little as 9 years, that was like a big, it was humiliating to the Russians. It was embarrassing. And even to the point that the Russians wanted to find out what the hell the Bulgarians were doing, the coaches and all, what they were doing with their training, that they were able to, in this amount of time, to overtake the strongest Olympic lifters in the world. They were sending waiters over to Bulgaria as sort of a decoy, but the main reason that these waiters were going over, they were going over to obviously work at a restaurant, but they were actually secretly going over to find out what the Bulgarians were doing. I mean, it was that competitive, and it was, when they're telling me this story, I almost couldn't believe it, but it was true. So anyway, so how did this all happen? I mean, how did Bulgaria do all this in 9 years? Well, it all had to do with their training and then their strategy and their mindset. They had a out-of-the-box strategy in the way that they trained their athletes. And it simply was this. They believed in doing application first and then theory second. Now, what the big deal is of that is that in our country, it's actually the other way. We focus on theory first, and then we do strategy, and then we do the application. And when you think about this in the way what this does, when you do application first, then that causes you to think outside the box, because what the Bulgarians did is they said, okay, first of all, you have to state what the goal is. And in this case, the goal was to develop the strongest men in the world. So they said, so we go into the weight room and they said, just think of the weights that are in there as tools. And okay, so we have these tools in front of us. Now, how are we going to make these men the strongest men in the world with these tools? Of course, we're talking the tools were the weights, okay? And then they said, all right, so what they ended up doing was they started trying things, okay? They started trying different exercises and different strategies. And what they came up with was they were essentially training their athletes 5 times per day, and they were doing 50 to 60 one-rep maxes, 50 to 65 times. These guys were going up and I saw this happen. I wouldn't have believed it if I just went to a seminar and they told me this. But because I was in front of these athletes, I was front row seat in this gymnasium where the strongest men in the world were lifting, and these guys were doing 50 to 65 one-rep maxes a day. How in the hell can somebody do that a day? And yet these guys were doing that. Now, one of the secrets behind why they could do that is because they figured out that they didn't do long training sessions. Their training sessions lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to 35 minutes, but it never exceeded, I mean, the longest they would ever go would be 45 minutes. And the reason why they were able, and they did this way, is because they figured out, and they had their own ways of checking their athletes to see how quickly they recovered. And by the way, they did it with doing a blood test in the earlobe. They would check the athlete's ear after they trained, and they would actually see what the athlete needed as far as nutrients were concerned, and they would supplement to them. And I just want to sort of on the front here, I wanted to address that some of the critiques that I got when I came back from Bulgaria and the athletes being this strong. They said, yeah, but they're on this steroid program. Listen, you'll be shocked to know that, yes, they were, and everybody was. at that level. There's no secret about that. But the Bulgarians they had a very rudimentary program like that as far as with the steroid program. It was shocking compared to in our country. Our country, we were doing a lot more steroids as far as in the athletics than they were. I mean, they really were. It was because of the training methodologies that they ended up developing and discovering just by simply going into the gym and learning through repetition being the mother of skill. And that was one of the big things I got out of it when I went to Bulgaria was they talked about repetition is a mother of skill. And that's the reason why, when you're going into an Olympic competition, you're only lifting that weight one time. And any time that you try that move, you're not doing 2 reps. It's just how strong can you be lifting the bar off the ground and over your head. But you do it one time. Getting back to the how they were training 5 times, they learned that as long as you didn't overtrain the body to begin with, and they figured out through their own way of testing that if you kept the training sessions more frequent and shorter, then it was virtually impossible to overtrain the body. Well, think about this. If you don't overtrain the body to begin with, there's no overtraining. The recovery is virtually very quick. I mean, they said it takes no longer than 5 hours. And much sooner than that because the body wasn't overtrained to begin with. That makes sense because, in where I came from as a bodybuilder, at that time, people were training in the gym hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes. And, but these guys were having to wait, the bodybuilders here in our country, they were having to wait sometimes 1, 2, 3 days before they could get back into the gym and train again, because what they were doing is they were severely overtraining the body to the point that they couldn't go again and be effective. Your body's not, if it doesn't recover, you're only as good as your recovery. So if you can't recover, you're not going to be the strongest people in the world, or you're not going to be able to grow the most amount of muscle mass that you possibly could. So this was really telling about the Bulgarians and what they had learned. And they learned this through the application of all these things they were trying, 50 to 61 rep maxes, training 4 or 5 times a day. And when they got to the point where they got the result that they wanted, here's what they did. Now they called in the people that did theory. And they said, look, theorists, we know that this works. Now tell us why it works. You see, the distinction there is that when they already know that it works, instead of being hamstrung by theory, doing theory first, being influenced by theory, they weren't. Now the theorists came in and said, well, that's a very good question, and here's why. So they were actually able to exactly tell and know just exactly what was working. You talk about being efficient. And like they said, and the most important thing was that this strategy and this methodology and their ideology and the way they thought kept them always progressing because they had to, in order to do that, as strong as they were and to keep dominating. So the reason why now that, they're doing 1 rep maxes, getting back to that now, is because in their sport, they just had to lift 1 rep. Does it make any sense if you really think about this? Does it really make any sense to train and do, for example, 3 reps or 4 reps when your event specifically requires you to lift 1 rep? It doesn't. And you would think that would be pretty much common sense, but you'd be surprised. And I know this from now when coming back and training athletes. When I came back from Bulgaria, I was already training athletes. And after I had this experience with the Bulgarians, it made me look at everything a lot differently. It's kind of like what they were saying is just be very specific to the goal. And yet so many of us, especially in our country, we're not. We have people that were training, for example, with sports that they were in that required explosive power, because sport is a combination of endurance, strength, and explosive power. And really, of those three components, the strength and explosive power are the two main ones. I mean, endurance-wise, the only athletes that you would really train for endurance would be the endurance runner, because they're an endurance runner. That's being very specific. So when you're setting up a training program, for example, for them, you would do a program that was typically lighter weight and the higher repetition, because that is going to build and develop endurance in the muscle. Make sense? Okay. But yet, I can't tell you, when I went to spring training with some of the baseball players and just some of the football players I ended up training, they were doing repetitions that were not specific in a training program that was not specific to their sport. That, when you line up a training program like what the Bulgarians were doing for their sport, when you line that the right kind of training program to the sport that you're in, and not only to the sport that you're in, but to the position of the sport that you're in, now this is when you start seeing results transcend from the weight room to the field. Because a lot of times back then, it's different now. We have now, again, I was ahead of, they were ahead of their times in the 1985. And when I came back from that trip, there were very many strength coaches at the colleges, and forget about high school. No one. I mean, they had one of the coaches, the assistant coaches, teaching a weight training class, which is fine, but it wasn't really specific to that goal. So you got to remember, back in '85, this was very unusual, and people didn't really know, how they should be training. And even to the point where when I was breaking into the professional baseball market to train those athletes at that time, they were so against doing a weight training program because they thought it would mess up their swing. And you know what? Intuitively, they were right. But now that we have more information, all the baseball players, or most of them now, are training in the sport because we understand how to train these people completely to a different degree. So the Bulgarians at that point were just so far ahead of everybody. They were right. They were at least 8 years ahead when I came back from that trip, because I swear to you, I started seeing some of the information when we started producing our training courses, because it was based on the Bulgarian philosophy. About 8 years later is when we started seeing other people starting to copy some of our programs. I mean, I'm flattered, but the point is that the Bulgarians were actually right. They were right about a lot of stuff. Okay, so that was their training. Be very specific and to the sport. Now, I asked them then, because in bodybuilding, it's very important that your nutrition is dialed in. I asked them, what about diet? I said, in my country, first of all, I said, what about diet? How do you feed your athletes? And they were emphatic. And they said, we feed them a high fat and a high protein diet. And I thought about that, and I thought, from my country at this time, fat was, eating fat in your diet was like a no-no. It was taboo. Fat was a culprit. And I told them that. I said, in my country, fat is not something, it's not healthy. So why in the world would you feed your athletes something that's not healthy? And they said, we don't care about their health. And I said, what the hell? I didn't say that. I was thinking it. What the hell? And they said, our goal is to develop the strongest athletes in the world, and this is how they have to eat. That philosophy, it took a while for me to really get that through my head, because all I could think about was, man, you guys are you don't care about human nature here. You don't. But they were so specific to the goal, it didn't matter whether or not it was healthy or not. Now, it turns out many years later, we know, and the reflection of what I'm about to tell you is all these diets that are on the market now that are basically high-fat diets. The keto diet, the our diet that we wrote, the anabolic diet, the Atkins diet. Okay, these are all different forms of a high-fat diet. They don't tell you in the industry that they are, because fat still has a negative connotation, but that's absolutely false. That is actually and can be very healthy for you. Your body needs that, and it's actually, in my opinion, a much better way to eat. overall. I know I used it and trained when I did my bodybuilding competitions, but the point that I'm trying to make is that they were ahead of their time, and turns out that the protein and the fat that they were eating were not necessarily unhealthy, but it was exactly what those athletes had to eat in order to become the strongest men in the world. And again, the point here is that it's always about the objective. And if you have an issue with that, and if you can't get through I'm not going to eat fat because I want to be healthy. If you can't get over stuff like that to reach a goal that is more specific to your objective, don't waste your time, because you're going to be pissed off all the time. You'll always be in conflict. The other thing I asked them about their protein intake was, how many grams of protein should an athlete take in? Now, keep in mind that as a bodybuilder, because I'm going over there asking a lot of questions from a bodybuilder's standpoint of view. And I said, they said, well, we have learned that the athlete needs to take between 3 to 4 grams per 1 pound of body weight. And again, compared to where I came from, I mean, at that point, Mike Minster was big during those days in the 80s, and some other people in the industry, but Mike stands out. But they were professing that all you needed was a half a gram per 1 gram for 1 pound of body weight, a half a gram for 1 pound. And the Bulgarians were saying, when I mentioned this to them, they said, absolutely not. You have to increase your protein up to as much as 3 to 4 grams per 1 pound of body weight. So the body needs that much protein in order to help it recover. So again, there was another area where the Bulgarians were just really, compared. I'm just using comparisons from my country. They were just way off the charts when it came to protein. Of course, some of the critics will say, well, you take that much protein, it's going to be hard on your kidneys and all that kind of stuff. And the truth of the matter is, as long as you're not dehydrated, as long as you just stay hydrated with water, and you don't have to overhydrate, just being hydrated, it clears the kidneys, and there's no issue with that. Based on what the Bulgarians learned. Wow, what a big difference. I mean, there were just so many stark differences like that. I was having I was there for I think 10 days or something like that. I was having these wow experiences like every day, based on the stuff that I was learning. And then here's another thing I thought was just fascinating. And this is this is a good example of how you either adapt or learn to adapt to a situation that you're in, or you die. Now, unbeknownst to me, again, I'm coming from America, where there seems to be an abundance of everything, at least in my own mind. And so they also went to tell me, the Bulgarians, they said, we don't, unlike your country, we don't have the luxury of having protein year round, something that we can count on. And I just couldn't believe that. I said, you mean you have times that you can't get protein? And they said that was exactly right. And I tell you, I know they were telling the truth, because when I was there, when I went to one of the stores there to get, I was just checking things out because I was interested. They had this meat store. They had all these stores that were kind of fractioned. They had a meat store, they had a bread store. Instead of having a supermarket in Bulgaria where I was at, it was all broken up. So you go to the meat store. I went to the meat store where they sold, chicken and red beef, and it was pathetic. It was shockingly sparse, where the meat was being stored in the freezers and the refrigerators, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. Not only, as an American, I started getting a real wake-up call to just how lucky I was to be from the country that I was from, because these people had to wait in line to get just simple staples of life like protein. Well, as it relates to the lifter, the coaches said, so, what were we supposed to do? We had to adapt. We had to come up with a way to somehow make sure that the body had enough protein, because obviously these athletes that were lifting all this weight, they needed this for recovery. So what they learned, and they taught me, was about protein starvation. And by that, I'm saying that they learned that by simply, and again, this is adapting to the situation that they have in front of them back then, is they said, so what we do with our athletes, because we can't get protein, is that for a certain amount of time, there's a certain amount of hours or days, they would actually starve the body of protein on purpose, and then they would actually start feeding it again on purpose in big amounts. So what the body did with that is that your body is very smart. It's your fight or flight nervous system. And when it perceives a threat like this, so when it doesn't get protein, which is something that it needs, protein is the most important macro in your body for various reasons. But when the body perceives a threat like this, it goes into fight or flight. So what the doctors discovered was that when they started feeding their athletes after starving them for, maybe 36 hours, all of a sudden the body would recognize that it had to hoard this protein. It would say, in other words, in layman terms, it was like, okay, the body didn't know. I don't know as a body, as an organism, metabolism, if I'm going to get protein again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this protein, I'm going to hoard it. I'm going to take as much as I can. And what they ended up doing in that case was the body learned actually to store more protein in the body, which is pretty hard to do because your body doesn't have the necessary capability to store much protein to begin with. But when you put your body in that kind of situation, or it thinks it's going to die, perhaps, it hoards the protein. And this is how the Bulgarians, in their outside of the box thinking, got around this stuff. Amazing. The funny thing was, that along with that protein starvation, the Bulgarians told me this story. I get so many stories that they told me over there that I keep thinking about 25 years later. It cracks me up. I just can't believe it. But they said, and I thought, this is bullshit what they're telling me. But here's what they told me. They said, okay, so what we learned about this protein, this certain protein they started taking, it's called Tribistan. It's big on the market now. I was actually the first one that brought it over in 1985, believe it or not, because the Bulgarians told me and talked to me about this. And they said it's basically a sticker, and that grows wild in parts of Bulgaria and in other places, but especially in this area of Bulgaria. So they said, well, how we learned about this as being an anabolic substance, in a way, a natural one, was that we had goats, they said. We had goats that were out there in this pasture, and the goats were separated. There was a group on the right side and a group on the left side. And they said, all of a sudden we started noticing that the goats that were always on the right side, and we put them, these goats all out at pasture at the same time, but the goats that were on the right side were markedly bigger than the goats on the left side. And then they wondered about that. Well, they figured out that it was because of this sticker that had these natural anabolic properties of producing testosterone naturally. And the truth was, they were right, because I brought some home. I was able to get it through customs, barely, because nobody knew customs. They asked me what the hell it was, and I told them that. And of course, they thought I was full of shit. And because they're looking this herb, because it's an herb, is what it is. They were looking it up in this. They have this special book that they look it up to. Right? They can see exactly what every herb is, and they couldn't find it in their book. And so I almost had trouble getting it through. Nevertheless, the point is, I got it through. And in our company, at the time, we decided to go ahead and see how legitimate this was. We did our own study on the Tribistan at that time. And what we found is that the Tribistan actually produced a spike in testosterone, legitimate spike. So this is, something that the Bulgarians started using as a supplement to protein, or something to develop, I should say, testosterone, and so they learned that this was something that they could actually use to bridge. In other words, when they were off their steroid cycle, they would go on this Tribistan cycle, and it maintained, so they wouldn't lose anything that they got from the drug. It's really hard to reproduce what a drug can do, to be quite honest with you. There's things out there in cocktails that you can do naturally that come pretty close, and Tribistan was probably the closest that I've ever seen, but it's pretty hard to do that. So Tribistan was a major find for them. And quick story about that. So once we learned that this was actually happening, where it was producing this testosterone naturally, well, guess what? We started ordering bigger and bigger shipments from Bulgaria, to the point that their shipments got so big that all of a sudden one day, because it was flying off the shelf. All of a sudden one day, one of the shipments got frozen, and because it was so big, they got suspicious and blah, blah, blah. Now, long story short, it started getting really hard to get, to the point where we had to stop selling it. But now years later, because they've, again, the Bulgarians being way ahead of us, now they figured out, and now they make this product called, even some places still call it Tribustin, or they call it Tribulus terrestris. That's the product that I brought over from the Bulgarians back in 1985. Those guys were so damn amazing. It was unbelievable. I mean, to this day, those guys are so relevant. So anyway, there's another story about this Tribustin. So what was so different about their philosophy now? Okay, now we've learned about their protein intake and what they feed their athletes, but there was more to it than that. And so we dig in deeper. And as I was learning from the seminars that I went to, and this is now, I'm back at home, and what the Bulgarians told me was that the Russians, for example, because again, they were the big dogs until the Bulgarians came by and bullied them out of first place, is that the Russians did what's called periodization training. And what that simply meant was that they put their athletes on a 12-week training program where they did a certain type of training for X amount of weeks. And then they would do a certain amount of training for X amount of weeks. And it all added up to that happened over a 12-week period. So what the Bulgarians figured out was that they could be more efficient if they did what was called periodization. So what they did, and what the Russians were doing in 12 weeks, they started doing this week to week. They were just more efficient, and part of that efficiency is, what I mean is that they were just doing these 1 rep maxes. So the difference in that strategy was that the Russians were only able to peak their athletes, in other words, get them ready for a show or an event, a lifting event, twice a year. Whereas the Bulgarians, because they were basically ready all the time with their training, it just simply the difference between the Russians doing more repetitions, even though they were lower, there's still more repetitions, and the Bulgarians were doing something that was just very specific to their sport, that they can have their athletes ready virtually at any time. Big difference. And so they were not only where they were competitive, they were competitive at a lot more events than the Russians were. Again, just another way that the Bulgarians just outsmarted the Russians in this case, They were always ready. Another thing that was shocking to me was stretching. And the Bulgarians are warming up, stretching and warming up. What I noticed when I was watching the Bulgarians train was that nobody warmed up. And I'm thinking, what the hell is this all about? These guys are first set, they're throwing on as much as 600 pounds, and they're doing their first set in a squat. You got to be joking. I mean, comparing to what we were doing in our country, and again, I know that I'm comparing it to bodybuilding, but what we did is we always thought that you did one set for 10 reps, and then you would just kind of build up slowly. You would do the next set a little bit heavier, kind of preparing the muscle, and you would do, less reps until you got to what we call the working set. The working set was actually what the Bulgarians were doing in their first set. So what they told me when I said, what's this all about? And they said, well, stretching is a waste of energy, and so is warming up. You don't need to do that. You can actually teach the body what you want it to do, but you got to, again, it goes back to training it for the specific goal. So in this case, they said, look, so I said, how can I make this and apply this to bodybuilding to where I can just eliminate all this warming up and just go right to my working set? And they said, well, listen, your body now has, based on what I was telling them, they said, your body has now adapted to the environment that you've taught it to adapt to. In other words, you're doing all these warm-up sets prior to getting into the actual working set. So they cautioned me. They said, look, you certainly don't want to go from one extreme to the other because, again, the body adapts to its environment. The body adapts to whatever you teach it to do. In my case, I was teaching it that I had to warm up first for a few sets before I actually got into the all-out working set. So they said what we suggest that you would do is that just slowly but surely start doing less and less of the warm-up. So you're not going to just go from one to the other. And over time, it took me, I think, probably, I'm going to guess a long time ago, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. It really didn't matter. But over time, what ended up happening was, in fact, I was able to start with my working set with set number 1. Those Bulgarians taught me that I could be ready to train. The minute I walked into a gym, it was so funny. This takes me back. Dr. Horine and I, we were in a gym. We go into gyms just to get a response. And we would go into a gym, and we would stick on 3 plates on the bench press, 315, our first set. And we would just crank them out. We were just, and people were just, they were shocked. They were looking at us like, what the hell are these guys doing? They're not warming up. But this is what the Bulgarians taught us, that you can make yourself ready immediately, and you don't have to warm up to do that. You're just teaching it that it needs that. Listen, when you think about physiology, it kind of makes sense. If your body's adapting to its environment, whether it be a training environment, in this case, lifting weights, or a work-related environment, when you're going to work and you're under stress, your body is adapting over time to that environment. Why? It's a coping mechanism. It's so you can be productive in that environment. That's all this is, except it's in a weight room. They also said that when you actually don't stretch and all that kind of stuff, it actually decreases the possibility of injuries, because when you look at the way people stretch sometimes and they still stretch wrong, is they overstretch. And when you do that or hyperstretch before an event or before you do something, you're actually in some cases weakening the joint. You're weakening the tendons, the ligaments for the sake of stretching. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a time when you might want to stretch if you've got a pulled muscle, and yet I don't believe that you have to do that, because I've had several pulled muscles throughout my 25 years of training. And I learned, again, through the Bulgarians, it was called active recovery, because they said you should never have to stop training. Hardly ever, never do you need to stop training because of an injury unless the muscle is pulled off the bone. They said do active recovery, which is where you lighten the weights up and you just do light weights, which recruits blood and oxygen, and these are natural healers. And they said your body will actually heal faster if you keep training through and around an injury. And they were right, and I proved it on myself. So, the fact that you have to stretch beforehand, even if you've been hurt, it's not really necessary that you do that. But I would say, if it makes you feel better, just don't overstretch, we're going to say, because you're just teaching your body that you need to do that before you actually go work out. Some of this stuff is still mind-blowing to so many people in the industry 25 years later. And just blows my mind. These guys, the Bulgarians, they coined repetition as the mother of skill, as well as the body becomes its function. The body becomes its function is actually Wolff's Law. And it's just simply saying that whatever you teach your body through regimen, it's going to adapt to it, period. I get all this information from these coaches, because I go to seminars when I'm in Bulgaria. Not only was I in the weight room looking at this firsthand, but I had the honor and the luxury to be in seminars with world level former gold medal Olympic athletes. They were now their coaches. I had sports doctors that were amazing, and here they are sharing all this information. And so I'm thinking, okay, so how do I, this is coming to an end now while we're there. And I'm thinking, how do I go back and how can we make this apply to bodybuilding? Because I asked the Bulgarians when I was there, I said, well, how come you guys aren't doing bodybuilding? And they said, because the being an Olympic lifter at that time in 85 in Bulgaria, if you were an Olympic lifter and on the national team, you were a rock star. And I saw that firsthand because I was hung out with the lifters in the evening. We'd go out at night, and when these people walked the streets, it was like the citizens saw a celebrity. It was wild. And at that time, you have to understand that these people were pretty oppressed. And I saw that with my own eyes. And they said that this is our way to not only brag to the world how good we are in something, but it's also a way for them to be able to travel outside their own country, believe it or not. I mean, when you think about that, as an American, I just thought that was just so weird that they were giving me that kind of an answer, and that in those days that it was that difficult. That's when they had basically walls up. I mean, it was so difficult, but yet as an athlete like that, the Olympic athlete, they could travel. They lived some of the life that we were used to on an everyday basis. Shocking reality check. But so anyway, but they said so. The sport of bodybuilding it doesn't have the popularity. And the athletes, essentially they just, you'd never hear about them, other than them just being in their own gyms in their own country training. But they said to me, the information that we're giving you can be applicable to what you're doing. Again, they kept saying, just make it specific to what your sport is. So this is when I came back, I got with my best friend, Dr. Horan. I said, Russ, I said, I think we got something here. And, sure enough, Russ, he's a mastermind at taking information and putting it together. And together, him and I developed the first training course, which is called Bulgarian Burst Training. And what we did with that, for some of you that weren't born yet, and we copied to a certain degree, sort of the strategy that the Bulgarians used, we actually set up a bodybuilding program where you train 3 times a day. I have to tell you that back in those days, and even to this day, the people that saw this training course thought we were full of shit. And how in the world could you train that much? It was a classic, the same critique. You're overtraining and you can't do that and blah, blah, blah. You're going to get hurt. And so we developed this training course that was 3 days a week. 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Now, mind you, we also knew that training 3 times a day for a large population of the people was not that user friendly because people have to work. But, for those that are super dedicated, our take was, well, if you really have perfect willingness, train before you go to work, train at lunch, train at night. I mean, you're not training like they were during those days, an hour and a half or 2 hours in the gym. So you could go in 20 to 30 minutes and knock out one of these programs. So you could do that. It just wasn't maybe commercially friendly, but something here was our take. We used the same approach and the strategy as the Bulgarians did. It was like, it didn't matter to some degree that it wasn't user friendly. What we wanted to do, and our stated purpose at that point, was to develop a bodybuilding program that produced the most amount of muscle ever. And this was what the program had to look like to do that. And that was that. That was like the Bulgarians eating fat and being unhealthy. It didn't matter if it's unfriendly. This is what you need to do, and you need to sacrifice if you want to put on, massive amounts of muscle. It was the fastest producing muscle building program at that time, and I will tell you that it still is, because they, just like the Bulgarians, the mark of a good program is that it stands the test of time. And I promise you, every one of the programs that we wrote, they were an evolution of each other, but they were built off of the Bulgarian Burst. So no matter which program that you try, whether it be Serious Growth, which is a second version, Bulgarian Burst, Big Beyond Belief was a third, and Titan Training, those all started and sprouted from Bulgarian Burst. So what we ended up doing in our training is so it was 3 times a day. People were training anywhere from 4 to 6 times in a week. And what we did is we took into consideration micro-periodization. So what we did throughout that week. Now, mind you, in bodybuilding, you're training more for volume instead of strength, to be specific. And why I'm telling you that is because the big discussion, even to this day, is which kind of a program puts muscle on faster, lifting heavy weight or doing lighter weight and more repetitions. I can tell you that at least 50% of the people that are out there, maybe more than that, will tell you that no, lifting heavy weight is what puts on weight faster than doing more volume, in this case, doing more repetitions. And the truth of the matter is, and the Bulgarians proved that in their own training, was that is false. Bodybuilding is a volume-based program. In other words, bodybuilders, and I've seen all this with my own little eyes in Gold's Gym, Venice, for a lot of years and all around the country, because I go in, I wanted to see what these guys were doing compared to what I was reading about in the magazines. And I can tell you that bodybuilding is based on volume, okay? Now, volume can go down as low as 6 reps, and it can be actually 4 reps if you do a lot of sets of 4 reps to make it volume. You see what I'm saying? Because you're now, if you did 6 sets of 4, you're doing 24 reps. Okay, it becomes volume. But generally speaking, a bodybuilding program, the volume goes from 6 reps to 100, believe it or not. So what we did in our programs is we, again, taking into consideration micro periodization, we actually put all that into a 6-day training program or a 4-day where you would do endurance. And the endurance that we were doing was more like, again, there's different versions, variations of endurance, because you can go all the way up to 100. But generally speaking, endurance was something around 15 to 20 reps. And the one that was a little bit lower as far as reps were maybe like 12 to 15. And then you had 6 to 10 or 12 reps, something like that. But the point is that we were doing endurance, strength, and power. And the power was related to bodybuilding because it was still based on volume. We did all that every week. Can you imagine doing all that in every week instead of doing, if we were to do it like the Russians did, comparing, we would do all endurance for so many weeks, and then all of the strength so many weeks, and all the power in so many weeks. You can see that in that case, it would take much longer to produce results. The Bulgarians were brilliant, and so we followed their lead. And you know something? It worked. That Bulgarian burst training program, as controversial as it was back then, believe it or not, I think it sold around 900,000 copies. And it was completely going against the grain. And that course actually was the beginning of us still being around today. You know, we were willing to come out and, like the Bulgarians, we were willing to come out and be different about this, because we just didn't say it. Not only did we learn this from Bulgarians, but Russ and I were in the gyms. I mean, in our own gyms, we were our own lab rats, and we put other people on that just to see how this would work, how it was going to time out in the gym. There was a lot that went into this, creating these courses, all of them. They have so much to the nth degree thinking and detail. I mean, timing out like how long the rest period should be. This thing was well thought out. This is the kind of stuff that a lot of times you don't really understand or see. And like, for example, these pro athletes that are playing at such a high level, you don't realize the time that goes into that thing, the repetitions being the mother of skill. You know, again, this is where I learned this from Bulgaria. But these athletes put so much time in. Russ and I did the same thing with Bulgarian burst and the rest of our training courses to the nth degree. And we knew that these programs worked. And it was based on the philosophy of the Bulgarians. You know, so I'm really proud of that. And I guess, you know, when I think about what Jerry and Carl said, wow, we did something. And I told Russ, I go, man, we did something. I mean, I think it's kind of cool to actually bask for just a few minutes, if nothing else, to realize that we made our mark. I mean, a couple of guys, we're just a couple of guys who had passion for training and took something and we followed through. We tested it. And, you know, Russ and I have always lived our lives, and it had to start with passion. How much passion did we have for this? And the result of that is that we're still around, and that we're coming back after 25 years, and we're getting back into the industry, and the podcasting that we're doing right now is sort of our way in to stir up the pot a little bit. And again, as I mentioned before in the beginning of this podcast, is, you know, to educate some of the viewers that weren't even born when we wrote the first 2 training courses and the ones before that, you know, because if it worked, it works now, it worked then, it'll keep on working. It's based on some solid in the trenches application training as well as science. And so, you know, here's the thing. I'm going to wrap this podcast up. is that, my mission and our mission at our company here is that, we're out to search for the truth. When we started in 85, one of the most important things that we wanted to do was make sure that we are talking straight to people. And I have to tell you that when you're talking straight to people, you're going to get a lot of pushback because you're going against the grain a lot of times. And I'm not saying that it's important to go against the grain just for the sake of it. But when you're going against the grain for the result of it, based on the stated goal, that's a horse of a different color. So nothing's changed for us here. We're searching for the truth back then. We're on that path again to search for more truth because things are evolving. And, you got to be willing to keep changing, even though it's uncomfortable. That's just the way it goes. So I'm really happy. And I hope that today's podcast is something that you really got some information and you learned some new stuff. And look, for me, it was something that I needed to do. And for those of you who have read all my stuff, and the first direct mail piece that we sent out was, I got to get this off my chest before I explode. And I know that if I didn't do this podcast today, I might not be able to do the rest of them because I would have exploded. And of course, I'm kidding, but you know what my point is. So anyway, until we meet again, as my old buddy Pax used to say, onward and upward.